Hi guys, we're Team 5 and we are going to be helping a startup named Qubra. So Qubra is a startup which aims to connect communities in New York City by providing affordable ground transportation between areas which aren't really connected by the MTA subway. So if you look at this map up here, this is Queens and down here is Brooklyn. So we have this gap right here where the subway doesn't really connect, and so Qubra wanted to use some of their retired school buses and city buses that they acquired to connect these areas. So they wanted us to analyze the traffic flow in these areas to plan the routes and the lines. So we used the turnstile data from the MTA, and pretty much it included the information for the stations and the entries and exits. So our sample was between September 19th and November 5th of 2015. So we just focused on that 48 days to give them a quick analysis to get back to them in their email. And our idea was to analyze the entry and exit numbers of each station to determine the popularity and where the demand for ground transportation would be higher.
Great. All right, so on this slide, this is pertaining to Brooklyn. So we did an analysis first on Brooklyn, which is the bottom half of the map, and then we did an analysis for Queens. So the first graph we have over here is the weekly entry counts. And then the second graph right to the side of it is the weekly exit counts. And so one thing that I wanted to point out that we found out here was that, as you can see, the top bar is Barclays Center, so it's the same as over there. We started to see that there are some stations that have a high number of people who either enter or exit during the day. And so we wanted to probably structure the analysis around saying that those would be potential areas where it could be transfer points for people to get off the train or travel to that area and then travel to their opposite destination, whether it be to Queens. And so, yeah, another possible one would also be J Street Metro Tech, which also shows high numbers in entries and exits during the day. Go to the next slide. And so this is the same sort of analysis for Queens. But something that we've noticed here that looks sort of different from the previous was that there's a different trend. And so if you notice, let's say for instance, Forest Hill 71, there are a high number of people who enter during the day, but then there's a significantly shorter or smaller amount of people who exit. And so when we were thinking about it, most people, if they go to work through the same station, then they would probably want to exit through the same station. But as you can see, there's a couple other examples in here, but that one sticks out. And our initial analysis is that there could be people who take different modes of transportations to and from work, depending on whether what time they go in and what time they leave work or what their schedule is like. So we looked into other sorts of transportation, such as MTA buses that are possible for them to take in the mornings or in the afternoons. And there's like Uber and Lyft, and there's also just a normal taxi service. You can switch.
Right. So the first chart you see here is essentially a deeper dive into one particular station. And the station that we picked was Jackson Heights, which you can see over there with the red arrow. Is that white bar, which represents a connecting station. And we picked the connecting station because we thought it would be an interesting one to look at first. So this chart here looks at all the entries stretched out throughout the whole period of time that we're looking at, which is 48 days. So we've seen this before. There are 7 peaks because there are 7 weeks in the data that we have. So the peaks represent the weekdays, and the tranches here correlate to the weekends of those weeks. And at the outset, it looks like at the bottom there are just 1 points for these bottom parts. But if you look closer, actually, there are some points where it's obvious that there are other points representing Saturdays, where it's dropping significantly. So just by looking at this, seeing how on weekends there's less than half of the average number of entries on weekdays. So this shows that weekdays are obviously the more in-demand commute times which our client can target. And these scatter plots here show, so this is Queens and that's Brooklyn. And the y-axis is the number of exits on a weekly average, and the x-axis is the number of entries. So just by looking, so also the scales are consistent, so it's 50,000 is the limit for each of the axes. And what you would expect, before looking at this, if you were to just kind of guess, you would expect that the number of entries to match up with the number of exits, because if you were to swipe your card and get into a turnstile at a station, you'd assume that they would come out of a station after pushing the turnstile for the exit at some point at a different station. But that's not what we see here. And one obvious reason for this, which we've actually found to be a topic of conversation on the web as well, is that in New York City, and Queens and Brooklyn as well, there are places where you can just exit without having to turn the turnstile. You can just exit through an exit door, which is set up to be like an emergency exit, but people use it. So that's
fee, right?
Sorry?
The flat fee.
Yeah, and also because there's a flat fee, once you swipe your card into the turnstile to get in, it doesn't really matter where you get off. So you don't have to swipe your card again to get out. You can just use any ways to leave the station. So that's what this is showing. So we have less entries than exits, and I think that's just a good thing to keep in mind and to be aware of.
Future steps include, so we want to know the particulars of actual station-to-station ridership, not just in general the overall trends of where what stops in Brooklyn and Queens are busy. One way to do that is to look by time of day and basically say, correspond the entries in one area with exits in other areas in the same sort of time basket, in order to get a sense of where people are coming in and where people might be coming out. Other data sets that might potentially make sense to incorporate in the future include anything that might be available on MTA bus ridership. You know, when you have this sort of U-shaped gap in a transit system, often there are bus lines already that fill that gap. Google Maps characterization of transit times, basically just if you're planning on thinking about a route from stop A to stop B, run the transit time via subway, existing bus lines, and car at several times a day over the course of the week, a few weeks, and see how much time you could save by going a more direct route. Uber and Lyft surge fares and wait times, again, you just queue up the app, might also be valuable metrics for characterizing, again, what the actual sort of non-subway ridership demand is at those points, aside from just, you know, who's riding the subway from Brooklyn to work in Manhattan. And then also investigation of other possible lines. You know, that was the sort of gap in the transit system, at least looking at the subway stations that most jumped out, but there were a few others that might be interesting to look at as well. And yeah, just looking at the infrastructure of the client and what their availability is to deal with those issues. I do want to point out, by the way, that the difference in entries and exits wasn't just at these stops. We actually ran it at every stop. And overall, the average was 76% of people who enter exit. And you don't really see the reverse. You don't really see any specific cases where you have significantly more exits, which I think is consistent with the hypothesis that it's the doors, and maybe there's some stations that are laid out in such a way that the doors are particularly more accessible, so maybe more people make it that way, which is why the ratios would be different.
All right, good job. Questions for these guys?
So you're trying to figure out bus routes, right, between the two streams. So isn't it, so the discrepancy between number of entries and number of exits, and like if one place has more entries, the other, if one place has more exits and the other one has less and more entries, then you would want a route established between those two areas, right? Because more people want to enter as more people are exiting.
Right.
So is that something you're looking at like cross, you know?
Right. So we didn't apply that approach because the counts we had there, we didn't apply that approach to those counts because those were daily. So that wouldn't really apply. Like most people, we assume would be coming back to whatever station they left. So you get an entry and an exit in general. But if you looked at it by time slice, for example, if you looked at which stops people are entering and leaving at between 8 a.m. and noon, and you found that X stop in Brooklyn is a major, source, Y stop in Queens is a major sink, then that would be that kind of evidence, and that is, definitely one of the next steps we would be doing.
And yeah, just kind of the point of showing this scatter plot was to show that the data is we have to be careful using because we were trying to take your approach into doing the analysis at first, but it shows that there's a disproportionate amount of entries. So we just can't take that data and make anything useful out of it because it's to some degree it's corrupted.
I just didn't get that. I thought you guys are trying to explore the possibility of getting the riders from Queens and Brooklyn, not necessarily like a link up between people who work in Queens to commute to Brooklyn, right?
We were looking at basically the possibilities for bus transit links that would basically close the gap of that U. Yeah, if you could pull up on that.
It's the former. It's actually the former argument of the line.
Yeah. Okay.
Right. Which is sort of the shortest subway path from here to here is rather circuitous, and that sort of jumped out at us.
Andrew can testify to that.
I did try to go from it's kind of simple as in York. It is a problem.
I guess just one comment on the chart on the next page. Just maybe make the axes the same on the bottom. Felt like I was having a wait, are they? No, not this one. Yeah, that one.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, just so it's a little easier to compare them.
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, no, I like this. I thought it was good that you, in general, like these charts with the caveat of making the axes go high. But I thought it was a good display to kind of see the counts side by side. Again, I like the sort of the sanity checking and the exploration of the data to really get a sense of how reliable is it. And I thought it was good that you kind of poked around and went on the web and looked for sort of some of the explanations to try to get a sense of that.
Yeah, I love that scatter plot.
And I think I wish we would have more time, but we did try to spend an even amount of time doing both the sanity checks, but also a proper amount of time doing the analysis. We saw that there was holes in the data where there's the turnstile would go back to 0, or there would be different trends that we would have to sort of I think the other group sort of try to take out as many cases as we could to sort of make it as great as we can. But yeah, just like the other group, we would have to spend more time going through the data.
No, and like we said, it's sort of unfairly short deadlines are giving you, so it's good. But I think that you guys are, from all the groups I've seen so far, I think people are really getting a feel for oh wow, data is messy, data is hard to work with.
That's an understatement.
And even with this, I think likewise. I mean, it's still it's really hard to think through the entries and the exits and what that means and what you should expect to see if people are commuting there and back. So I should see more entries here and more exits here. But and it's a really hard thing because then at the same point, you can't really tie the individual entry to an individual exit. So you don't know really. You could maybe make some vague hypotheses about the flow, but it'd be hard to really say, oh, people are going from this point A to point B. It's not like the part in San Francisco where you check in and check out, and they can actually track as the person who put the card in at the station to go at another station. And after you said the thing about the open stations, I think in Brooklyn and Queens, especially when you get really far out, it's kind of like some of the Muni stops here, the above ground Muni stops, where you just kind of walk up, and so there's, a turnstile when you check in, but then when you get out, people just jump out. So that made sense.
if those values, like if those reflected like the design of the stations, you could actually use those ratios maybe to try and correct for the missing exits at each particular station.
Yeah.
You know, some of them they look pretty similar to entries, but
Yeah, and that would be interesting with it to be like, you know, again, another idea you could look at is, look at that ratio station by station and then see if, like, certain features of the station predict what that gap is.
Yeah.
You know, like, if you have half as many exits as entries and it's a certain kind of station layout where there's an obvious way to get out without hitting the turnstile, whether that lines up with your station. All right, thanks guys.
Thank you.